of the social side, platform independence, and so forth. And so there's lots of opportunities for software companies to interact at that level. Data-connected networks is a term. This gets a little bit complex, but if you write your agreements with your customers properly, then the data, the terabytes of data that flow across your systems on a continuous basis can be extracted, anonymized, and it's what the trends and tendencies that are showing have another concentric ring of value, and we've sold companies strictly on the basis of that additional dimension. The core technology was interesting, but the real value driver was the data-connected network. Digital currency flow, of course, you've all heard of Bitcoin, where this is on beyond that. It's streamlining the process of currency transfers, digital currencies and mobile wallets, et cetera, cryptocurrencies and so forth. The Internet of Things, that term has been pretty widely used. It's on beyond M2M right now, right? But there's, I think, 30 billion connected objects by 2020 and $300 billion worth of market value associated with that phenomena. Analytics are very important in that. Of course, anything that can be monitored, tracked, transduced, and telemetered will be and is being right now. So that's on the connect side. Moving to the creates, oops, see if I can make this go back. Mobilization and mesh systems, advanced manufacturing, and so forth. Mobilization, this obviously, if you don't have a mobile dimension to your product now, you're missing opportunities. This is on beyond BYOD, and there are many companies now that have titles that are effective chief mobilization officers to use the equipment that the employees are bringing to work to the benefit of the corporation. And mesh systems is the blurring the lines between where the hardware leaves off and the software picks up, and it's on beyond embedded systems. And again, you're seeing this in embedded devices, wearable devices, avionics, in industry, automobile, personal equipment as well. Advanced manufacturing, this is 3D printing, robotics, the analytics associated with that, real-time manufacturing software systems that accelerate and improve the manufacturing. And software companies can now compete with a lot of the industry that's been pushed offshore, if you look at it from a US perspective for manufacturing. Now companies are onboarding or inboarding this technology. It gives them the real-time ability, and you're seeing, at least we're seeing in the United States, a lot more of that happening at a corporate level. Digital force multipliers is a phenomenon whereby there's a new generation of tools that enable companies to bring on their own software. They, both on the hardware and the software side, and the enmeshed and advanced manufacturing factor into this as well. So the buyers like this because in a big ERP system, of course, you would just license an existing cloud service or something equivalent to that. But there's a law, it's called Conway's Law, and it basically means that if companies build certain aspects, sort of shoehorn aspects or on-ramp aspects of software in-house, then it kind of capitulates the sense and the personality of the company, and it's all the more efficient. So that's another phenomena that we're seeing happening. We've got several companies in market now. And then information security, of course, the last one here. The previous 9 were all about dropping barriers, reducing barriers, streamlining processes. In this case, thanks to Mr. Snowden and the RSA, NSA issues, and a number of others that we've seen in the last number of years, there's a whole new genre of security that's opening up for more boutique solutions that obviate the liability associated with a single point of risk. And so that sort of shattering realization across the user populations has created yet another opportunity, and there's several companies here represented in this conference that are focusing in that area. So let's spend a few moments talking about M&A activity, evaluations, and deals. This slide is good news to this group here, generally speaking. So start on the, we've taken 6 representative public companies, for example, and we're showing the cash reserve delta from over the last 7 years in billions of dollars. So just use Apple as an example. An increase of $150 billion, representing 1,600%, and the amount held offshore represents 76% of their cash reserves. And look all the way down the line. I don't know what the average there would be, something in the high 70s or, yeah, in that range, I imagine. So a ton of money that's waiting to be spent. You either spend it to buy companies and grow, as most of the strategics are, and many of the private equity groups are with vast portfolio holdings, platforms and bolt-ons, and so that's where this relates to the strategics, of course. But that money is there to be spent. When Microsoft, for instance, bought Skype for $8 billion, they took some heat that was an excessive amount to spend, but when you consider there's a 40% repatriation tax to bring those monies back onshore, U.S., maybe it wasn't such a bad deal. That money is really there to be spent. John Chambers at Cisco made that declaration a year ago that they wouldn't buy any more U.S. companies until those cash reserves were drawn down somewhat. So here's a graph that shows the excessive amounts or unprecedented amounts of cash on both the strategic and the private equity side. PE's got twice what the strategics have to spend, and they have to spend it in order to exact their fees, and so they're very aggressive. Sometimes we only take companies to the private equity groups if the theme is right. They're really in love with SaaS offerings, of course, and it becomes a feeding frenzy toward the end. I'll talk a little bit about how the quorum process works in terms of taking a buyer's list, maybe a funnel of 80 to 120 buyer candidates. That's typical for us, and boiling that down to maybe 25 highly qualified and interested candidates. We sort of fade back into the orchestration mode at this point and put the buyer and the seller toe to toe. And that's where the fun really begins and value is increased over the course of that. So here's a chart that shows the top strategic acquirers for the first half of this year. Yahoo eclipsed Google for the first time last year by taking the lead in terms of the number of acquisitions, but Google has stepped up again, and if they continue at the pace that they've managed for the first half of the year, they'll be over 40, and I think that will be setting a new record. Here's a list of the top private equity acquirers, and this list goes on and on and on. There's a lot of money in play, of course, but we've done deals with all these guys, and they're quick studies. It used to be that the private equity groups were kind of stodgy. They would require high amounts of EBITDA in order to be interested in the company because they want to debt finance the acquisition and then stretch their investment tranches further. As you saw from the previous slide, that's no longer the case, and so they look more like strategics all the time. Very quick studies. This graph shows the aggregate of 6 markets: vertical, horizontal, consumer, internet, infrastructure, and IT services that Quorum tracks on a monthly basis. And if you'll give me your card at the end of this session, by the way, I'll be glad to send you this deck and an invitation to our Tech M&A Monthly. It's a webcast that happens every 30 days, and it covers both those 6 sectors and the 27 subsectors that fall in beneath those. I gave more detail on that in previous sessions. But just to underscore that, so the average, you're seeing revenue multiples and EBITDA multiples charted here. So revenue multiples in the 2.43 area, and EBITDA multiples in the 12.5 area, yeah. So lots of activity. And these are multiples that are predicated on public companies. So the private companies are somewhat different. I put this slide in here. It's not specifically germane to the global radar theme of this presentation, but I thought it'd be interesting. Especially on the private equity groups, I mentioned those groups before, they cared about earnings, and we would use discounted cash flow as one of the 3 ways to triangulate on a kind of a range of value just to calibrate how a company should be positioned and what their anticipation should be prior to going to market. But this graph shows basically a revenue multiple applied not to anything related to earnings at all, and that's why discounted cash flow is sort of irrelevant in this calculation, but as a function of year-over-year growth. Does this work here? Yeah. So if a company was at 30% year-over-year growth, they could expect something like a 5.5 times revenue multiple, which is pretty good and this relates to private software companies. And we're seeing that and more these days. So very, very strong activity. Here are the mega deals that have been done in the last, through the first 3 quarters of 2014. Oh no, I'm sorry, this just pertains to the 3rd quarter. I don't have the data for the previous 2 quarters, unfortunately, but you can kind of see the trend and where the money is being spent. Were we able to see the prior 2 quarters, I think these bar charts would shift somewhat. I don't think this pattern is necessarily preserved, but that's what's going on now, and when we define a mega deal as anything in excess of $1 billion. So here's what's going on around the world in terms of buyers and sellers, and I think if you start in North America and go clockwise, that's the order, kind of descending order of activity. And I'll give you an exploded view on this in a moment. So buyers and sellers in North America, followed by European buyers and sellers, then Asia, Middle East and Africa, and then Latin America kind of bringing up the rear. And here's some detail. Not surprisingly, most of the buyers and sellers, most of the deals are being done on the west coast of the United States, followed by the east coast, and then and southeast, Midwest, and Canada. Latin America, not so much activity down there, more sellers than buyers, which kind of makes sense. Here's the sector here. Southeast sector, Australia and Oceania kind of leading, followed by India, buyers and sellers, lots of activity here. We are really impressed with what, that is to say, Quorum Group is quite interested in participating in what's going on here in India. We were here last March, my colleague was, and then I met Ravi in the Bay Area at the InnoTrek conference in May, and then was invited to come on back here. We are very interested in putting a shoulder on the wheel and seeing if we can be a smart conduit to the opportunities, the companies, the software companies here, moving them into some of the world markets where there's more activity and better value to be had. And then here's what's going on in Europe. Western Europe comprises the bulk of the activity, and lots going on in the Nordics. We have an office in Amsterdam and one in Norway, and they're seeing, these are, if you saw what happened last year, there's a fairly impressive delta in terms of activity buy and sell side as well, and then Eastern Europe. So here's 10 reasons why tech M&A will remain strong. As I mentioned in some minor detail, there's extraordinary change, these planes of disruptive technology that are combining and colliding to create the most active M&A market that we've seen in a decade or more. And it's accelerating, as you might expect, as we continue to kind of move out in terms of expanding the technology and combining the technologies. Companies the internal rate of development success failure is about the same as the external rate. Some dispute that fact, but anyway, if a company has an opportunity to, if a strategic, let's say, by way of example, has an opportunity to buy a company that's already done all the heavy lifting technologically and has made some market progress, in other words, vetted it across a pretty wide range of customers, starting to develop a channel and proven the technology, it's far better to buy that company in terms of time to market and all the other mistakes that they're going to forego than to develop it internally. The challenge here would be to move the needle in the world markets for a small company. I'm just using by kind of a rule of thumb I've developed over the last couple of days that a $500,000 revenue company in India is probably equivalent to a $5 million company in the United States in terms of what they've accomplished. But those concentric rings of sales and marketing and channel development are lacking in many cases, and that's the issue that we'd like to get involved with. Help that along. Moving along, strategic buyers have record cash. The private equity buyers have record over $1 trillion available. Debt is at its lowest cost ever, and new public foreign buyers. Entrance of new non-tech buyers, as you use Bosch as an example, and that's an increasing phenomenon. Crowd-funded buyers. American companies are cheap relative. Now this is a U.S. perspective. Again, our currency is down relative to a lot of foreign currencies or international currencies. Most U.S. buyers' cash is international, and software is rising in importance. To use an example, IBM's crossed the line about a year and a half ago. They are, I think, 52% of their revenues are derived from software products. And of course, HP, Leo Apotheker lost his job a couple of years ago by kind of mishandling his pronouncement that HP was going to get out of the hardware business and concentrate on the software side. But as you can see recently in the split, they are continuing to move in that direction, as is Dell. So just to touch on the dark side here are some concerns that one should keep in mind in terms of market timing, and it may not be as relevant to this crowd because the companies are more in the startup phase, or at least that's my sense. There are, of course, companies that are ready to go to market, and it may be a good time to test or calibrate to the market. Currency crisis or inflation increasing, these are kind of the usual suspects, and I'm not surprising anyone, I'm sure, but stock market adjustment or sector consolidates. These are some of the phenomena, and the next slides show how this kind of works. So here's the public markets over the course of the last 12 months, NASDAQ, Standard & Poor's, and Dow Jones. Now the M&A markets don't 100% correlate with the public markets, but pretty close. And so here are the last three peaks, and of course here's where we are right now. There's some expectation because we are in the 5.7-year mark of the fourth largest bull market since the U.S. Great Depression back in the late 20s. that we are spring-loaded for a reset. Now, all other indicators or crucial indicators would give us some confidence that the conditions that we are enjoying now will persist. But sometimes just a pebble in the path is enough to knock you in the ditch. And so these are things to consider moving forward. And here's a quick slide that just shows that we had a pretty significant reset in the U.S. stock market here recently. That's going on with ISIS and the Ebola crisis and what's going on in the Ukraine and so forth. So there's a lot of issues, sort of components to the equation that may tip things over, and nothing goes up in a straight line. A correction, or at least something that mitigates a massive correction, would be expected and maybe even helpful. However, and here are some of the things that I've covered earlier. I'll flip through this pretty quickly just to preserve time. But and again, this is a bit of a U.S. perspective. But so things are moving along well. Strong fundamentals still in place. Record cash. I touched on these. More buyers than ever. Cheap debt. High valuations, and mostly cash deals. Mostly what we do. And at any given time, Quorum will have probably 25 to 30 engagements in the market. There are 12 deal makers like myself. I didn't give much background, but we're all senior. There's 5 seniors dedicated to each engagement team. We have all held operating roles, as Ravi introduced early on. I'm not atypical. All the deal makers at Quorum have stood in the shoes of our clients, and we can run interference effectively for them during the front end of a process, particularly where it's very labor and task intensive. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's like anything else. Surgery, for an example, you really want some good help, and you'll get best leverage that way. Go broadly, go global, and I'll touch on some of these things in a minute here. So optimal outcome, again, I mentioned, is a phrase that we've come up with that describes what a process should look like when it's done properly. And we share this broadly. It's not Quorum-centric. It's just what we've experienced over the course of the last 25 years by way of what works best. And so we've designed this kind of drivetrain of functional elements that's the mechanics of a process that's very effective and efficient. Overarching that, and perhaps even more important, or at least it's a good 1-2 combo, is the relationships that exist that can enable, by way of by endorsement and process, that makes these deals come together in short order. So I don't know if I may have mentioned this, but at any given time, any one of us may have 5 to 6 engagements. Well, that's a lot of work if your process isn't efficient. So we've tuned that up, and I'm going to describe it just briefly here in the moments that remain. So we call it a problem. It's not right or wrong. It's just the way it exists, right? When a man and woman come together for a marriage, they have different perspectives, right? The war of the sexes, they call that. Whether we smile as we say it, that's just the environmental, right? And the same thing is true between a buyer and a seller who want to, after the LOI engagement ring, get married. You don't want to be tired of that marriage by the time you get to the altar, however. So if you can do your pre-LOI conversations properly and streamline that, then the due diligence phase, which is where the industry joke is where deals go to die, then that will go a lot more smoothly. And by the way, over the last couple of years, Quorum has spent more time in the LOI phase just to ensure that issues that might be thorny or that we perceive will be obstacles during the course of the due diligence are baked into the LOI, get those pieces on the table and kind of resolved. It protracts that LOI phase, but there is a glow on the relationship, and that candidate is contending with, say, 5 other buyer candidates who also want to take this girl's hand in marriage to completely destroy the metaphor or to completely overuse the metaphor. So price structure liabilities and non-competes, and as this says, you are diametrically opposed. Not that that's a bad thing, but you need some help. And I think it would be like stepping up to a complex game table in Las Vegas and not knowing the rules. You could figure it out eventually, and all the clients that we work with are very bright entrepreneurs, and they could do this, but we have a lot of horror stories that describe how one comes to conferences, reads some books, tries it, and then takes their eye off running the business during this really crucial time of the engagement, and things go south. M&A process is tougher. Yeah, Sarbanes-Oxley and more tasks than people realize. Busy buyers. A lot of the strategics, for instance, because we have them on our panels and we hear from them, they review hundreds of opportunities a week. They're really looking for, oftentimes, like when you go to the mailbox, if this metaphor works here, when we do, there's 9/10 of the mail is junk mail. Well, you're looking for reasons not to have to read it. And that's the same thing there. When we put our documentation together, they're very terse, very crisp, and to the point. And the first paragraph of that executive summary, which is only 12 pages long, it's not a book. They won't read something that long. They'll set it aside, intend to read it, and they never will get to it. But that has to be very engaging. If they read that, they'll read the first page. If they like that, as a senior guy, then I'll give it to an associate, and the deal can get done on that basis. So you don't want to presume upon these guys that are really busy. You want to convey the message very crisply and compellingly. Outside professionals, more complex due diligence required. Deal fatigue is a big deal, is a big thing in these engagements. So here's what the optimal outcome encompasses. There's 6 elements. Of course, price, valuation, maximizing that is always important, but more important than price, really, and we can make this case in detail, is the structure. And that encompasses not only how the deal is paid out and what the stay bonuses and the non-competes and all the other things that are involved there, relocation, escrow, indemnification, reps and warranties, all these other things are a factor into it. And in a competitive, what we call an auction environment, where you've gone broadly, you started with a universe of buyers and kind of narrowed that down to a select few. Along that path, you put these pieces on the table, and my job as the orchestrator of an engagement is to stack rank or feed back to the various candidates where they stand in that ranking, not in full confidentiality. You don't give the specifics, but you let them know where they are, and they want to buy you for all the right reasons, and they don't want their competitors to buy you, and that's the dynamic that we leverage effectively. So then following that is maximizing personal liability and risk. Your taxes, of course, you want to prepare with the end in mind early on. All these things should be considered even now, and that's again what Quorum does. Is we work for years in advance, offering informal advice at no charge to the clients, so that when the time comes, they are really ready and not have to be scrambling around to pick up the pieces. And finally, integration. This is an element that's often left off the table and handled later. And Ernst & Young has done a report. I think it's about 3 years old now, but according to the buyers and sellers, 53% of the time the deal did not go well, which is a pathetic number. It's really a sad situation. And oftentimes the seller, they may be, if they're mature and they want to kind of move on with their life, in the rearview mirror is a company that's falling apart and collapsing, and all their friends, I mean, this is really a family situation that's oftentimes created, have not been dealt properly, and so integration is a key aspect, and we will engage the away teams. We'll get on the plane and we'll get the teams together at that point in the due diligence process where we're confident that the deal is going to conclude. And that relational aspect is good glue, and things get on the table before we sign the deal. The LOI is non-binding, as you know, but when we sign that final deal, we want to have all these pieces in view and in place. Here's the optimal outcome drivetrain that I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to go into the detail, but preparation, research, contact, discovery, negotiation, due diligence, closing, and integration, that's the span that we're encompassing. There's some overlap or underlap here, but each of these chevrons is a distinct element of the process. Preparation, that phase, if you saw the exploded view of it, starts now. And that's getting alignment within the core group, planning where you want this to end. Pick that point on the horizon where you want to end up, and then you kind of work back from there. And get someone to kind of help you with that. There's a lot of pieces, and it's great to get some help. So here we track all this stuff. We've invested about $25 million in a database system about 20 years ago, and so this may not be particularly relevant, but since we track it, we're displaying it. 20 to 300 global buyer candidates, 700 to 1,000. This is more like 2,000 these days, it seems. Communications of various kinds, 10 to 30 expressions of interest, 5 to 15 NDAs signed, and conversations taking place, 3 to 8 qualified parties, 1 to 3 plus offers. And that's kind of how it works. So at the end of the process, optimally, you've got several candidates, all of which, or any of which, you would be pleased to sell your company to. And then you can have the conversations around structure and price and some of these other things. The escrow goes away, and you have some leverage at that point, and all of them are good candidates. That's the optimal outcome. Typical averages for a single buyer. Here's some more data that's not necessarily interesting, but anyway, 6 contacts to get to the first discussion and 23 more to get to negotiation. So there's a lot of steps in here. These guys are busy. It takes a while to get their attention and to get these conversations queued up and moving forward. 9 to 12 months required to complete because of the workload, Sarbanes-Oxley, and so forth. and 3 to 5 man-years of in-house or professional work. So there's a lot of effort involved here. You want to dedicate maybe one officer in the company to kind of superintend the M&A process, and then work with your consultancy. Let them do most of the heavy lifting. And as I mentioned, that's what we do in terms of the preparation, the executive summary, and the financial models, and the teaser documents, and the buyer's lists, and all that iterative stuff. We're thinking of coming back and putting on what we call a selling up, selling out workshop. That's a 4-hour stem to stern, entire exploded view, the entire schematic of what the process looks like, just to share broadly with the companies that will be at that point eventually. IPOs are not that prevalent these days. Mergers and acquisitions is how value is achieved. And in general sense, our clients have all their personal wealth tied up in a single private stock. When the time comes, when you get that inbound interest, and that's indicative that the buyer universe thinks you're ready, you want to be ready and not have to be scrambling to get the pieces together. And so that's what that workshop encompasses and describes. What percentage of instances will there be other buyers willing to pay more than the first one that approached you? And this is, again, over 25 or maybe 20 years worth of data collection. Anyone want to guess, venture a guess? Someone said 100% yesterday. That wasn't too far off. It's 75%. In other words, only 25% of the time, according to our data on 300 plus company sales, will the original offer be the ultimate buyer of your company. And if they are, according to our data, in an orchestrated environment, the price will have gone up 48%. So almost half again the price when you have some competition. Dealing with one buyer, that sort of underscores the point. How am I doing for time? Am I out? Okay, good. Well, I think this is a pretty good place to stop anyway. So anyway, thank you very much. You've been a great audience, and look forward to meeting with you. If you give me your business card, I'll be glad to send you the deck. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that, Robin.